The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased today to rise to speak to Bill 182, a bill that would see the minimum wage in Nova Scotia reach $15 an hour over 3 years. I think it's important to note that across Canada, almost 7% of workers make minimum wage. And of these workers, more than 40% are under 20 years old. The right-wing Fraser Institute, however, points to these numbers and argues that the issue only concerns young people still living at home. However, the picture changes when you consider those who are being paid less than $15 an hour. In fact, 60% of these workers are 25 or older, 35% of them are over 40. While the Fraser Institute threatened that 1 in 6 jobs would be lost in British Columbia if they raised the minimum wage, that supposition has actually been proved wrong. David Green, a professor at the Vancouver School of Economics at UBC and an international fellow at the Institute for Fiscal Studies in London, reports that employment losses in British Columbia as a result of wage gain for those over 24 had no discernible effect. In fact, he says, 4 years after the BC minimum wage was increased, employment remained the same as in the rest of Canada. I think that's very important to keep in mind, Mr. Speaker, especially considering some of the things that our other colleagues have said here today. And I'm thinking perhaps they got their numbers from the Fraser Institute report, which is very biased. Nova Scotia, in fact, actually has the second lowest wages in Canada. I'm going to repeat that, Mr. Speaker. I think it's an important note. Nova Scotia actually has the second lowest wages in Canada. This is a serious problem, Mr. Speaker. Low wages not only impact people and their families, but our province's economy as well. Nova Scotia has a serious wage issue. Simply put, people are not earning enough money to live comfortably, to provide for themselves and for their loved ones, and to adequately contribute to our province. Mr. Speaker, we also know we have an aging province. So those people who are aging and becoming 65 years of age is rapidly growing, and we've just reached the point, Mr. Speaker, where there are more people dying than there are being born in Nova Scotia. So our workforce is going to be very, very important in keeping our economy alive and growing and contributing taxes to the system. So, Mr. Speaker, we also know that it is women who will benefit from an increase to the minimum wage almost the most. More than 60% of employees earning minimum wage or less in Nova Scotia are women. Mr. Speaker, I gave a speech the other day to the Federation of Seniors and Pensioners in Truro, and I talked about this issue of so many people in our province who are living on the poverty line, below the poverty line, and who are only making minimum wage and barely able to put proper food, healthy food on their tables, pay for their medications, pay for their rent, and even have any extra money over to enjoy a little bit of beauty in their lives. You know, what comes to mind, Mr. Speaker, is that old song that, that the women used to sing about bread and roses. And they said, yes, it is bread we fight for, but we want roses too. Don't average, ordinary people in Nova Scotia, don't they deserve to have a little bit of beauty in their lives as well, rather than struggling just to make ends meet? And that's what we're finding many of our fellow Nova Scotians are doing. They are just getting by, they are just making ends meet, and they have no extra money left for a little bit of beauty And that's why Bread and Roses is so actually important for us to remember today. And as I said, more than 60% of employees earning minimum wage today are women. According to the Center for Policy Alternatives, women make up 100% of those employed in 6 of the 10 lowest paying occupations in Nova Scotia. Now, as critic for the status of women, this really gives me pause, and it really should give every single member in this legislature pause. All of us have mothers, sisters, children, and surely we should care in this day and age about equality, about the quality of life that women lead in Nova Scotia. And as I said, according to the Centre for Policy Alternatives, women make up 100% of those employed in 6 of the 10 lowest paying occupations in Nova Scotia, and that includes the minimum wage. Women are also far more likely than men to be employed part-time in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Women, in fact, make up 67% of individuals who are employed part-time. And many times this is not because they chose to. It's because they're desperately trying to get a job, to make a living that will put food on the table. And many times, Mr. Speaker, I have to say the women I've spoken to have said they will go hungry so that they can put the food on the table for their children. And when I hear today in the House that for children that are born in Nova Scotia, a large majority of them are being born underweight, I have to think poverty. Probably poverty has a lot to do with that. Mr. Speaker, the other day when I gave that speech to the Federation of Seniors and Pensioners, after I gave the speech, this lovely older woman came up to me and she thanked me and she had tears in her eyes and she had a nice dress on and she just said, you know, I want to say to you, thank you. Thank you so much for bringing up this issue of inequality, because she said, I am one of those people who are struggling. She said, I try not to show it, and I come to these meetings and I go to as many meetings as I can, but I make under $20,000 a year, and it's not easy. And Mr. Speaker, I have to say, it conjured up an image of Bette Davis, the old movie actress who said, old age ain't for sissies. Well, poverty ain't for sissies either, Mr. Speaker, and unfortunately many of us here in Nova Scotia are suffering, and they're not sissies. Mr. Speaker, we also know that the average earnings of women are significantly lower than men. On average, women in Nova Scotia earn less than $30,000. Low income in Nova Scotia is the most prevalent among women in lone parent families, and as a result, we see disturbingly high rates of child poverty in our province. And many of these women are trying to live on minimum wage. I see them in my office, Mr. Speaker, in Truro, which is quite a bustling little town. But you know, Mr. Speaker, Truro has poverty right at our very doorstep. There's homelessness, and there is the food bank, and it's been going up and up and up. And the majority of people that are using it, Mr. Speaker, are women and children. Shame on our province that we are not doing more for the people who need it most. So, Mr. Speaker, many of the people I talk to are not just doing one minimum wage job. They're doing 2 or 3. Some of them work at night cleaning buildings while they're trying to earn a wage in the daytime, and their kids are going to school. They're trying to buy clothing for their teenage kids, and as anyone knows who has teenage kids, they go through food pretty quickly and like to drink a lot of milk, and so they should, because their bones are growing, they are growing, they're expanding, and they need as much healthy food as they can be to be healthy adults and to have their brains functioning properly, which is surely what we want and need in this province, where of aging people, where we're going to need as many bright young minds as possible to keep our province going and to be able to get good jobs that pay and put money back into the province's coffers. So bumping our minimum wage up over 3 years to $15 an hour You know, there's a lot of people in Nova Scotia who would be very happy by this. One more thing I'd like to add there, Mr. Speaker, is that, as some of us know, I come from Australia originally, Sydney, Australia. And I'll tell you, the minimum wage in Sydney, in Australia, is over $18 an hour. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's a business owner in Truro, doing very well. And we were having this discussion about minimum wage and whether it's good, whether it's bad, what it would do for the economy, what it would do for his work. And he said, oh, well, you know, like $15, that's an awful lot of money for minimum wage. And I said, well, you know, in Australia, it's $18.22. He said, I find that hard to believe. I said, well, Google it. He Googled it. Sure enough, $18.22 an hour. And we started looking at other countries, Mr. Speaker, and there's a large majority of countries where they have minimum wage much over $15 an hour. So in some ways, we are behind the times here in Nova Scotia. And it would be nice for us to get on the bandwagon and be a leader instead of a follower, Mr. Speaker. And I think Nova Scotians would like to see that as well. So low wages do impact, as I've said, senior women who are far more likely to be considered low income than their male counterparts. And seniors are really not the only ones hurting, Mr. Speaker. Income inequality is an issue for all of us. According to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, the average income of the top 1% of earners in Atlantic Canada is nearly $260,000. And by contrast, the bottom 90% earn an average of only $26,700. So we know how far an income of less than $30,000 goes in today's economy. Not very far at all. Yet this is a reality for far too many people in this province. When you factor in rising health care costs due to the lack of government investment, what we have is a crisis for all of us in Nova Scotia, and especially for women, for children, and for seniors. We tried to address this crisis while we were in office between 2009 and 2013. And on the issue of health care, we opened Canada's first collaborative emergency care centres to provide 24/7 emergency care, same or next day appointments. And as a result, ER closures were reduced for 4 years in a row. We brought the emergency room to people with our Restore program so that paramedics could administer drugs, clot-busting drugs to patients having heart attacks instead of waiting until arriving at the hospital. We introduced the Fair Drug Pricing Plan, which caps the price of generic drugs, lowering prices, and is a much better deal for our taxpayers. In fact, when we got into office, Mr. Speaker, I remember the generic drug price was 85% for Nova Scotians. 85%. It was 25% in Ontario. And our seniors were bearing the brunt of that. So our then Minister of our then Minister of Health, Ms. Maureen MacDonald, she went toe-to-toe with the pharmaceutical companies, and guess what? She got them down to 35%, from 85% to 35% for Nova Scotians. And I would say that is working for our tax-paying public and for our people also living in poverty. On income inequality, we eliminated the provincial income tax for seniors receiving the guaranteed annual income supplement, which was a change that impacted 18,000 people. We introduced and indexed the affordable living tax credit to provide financial support to about 15,000 of the most vulnerable low-income citizens of Nova Scotia, many of whom, Mr. Speaker, have disabilities. And we created Nova Scotia's first affordable housing strategy. While in government, we strove to be a strong voice for many people, and we increased the property tax rebate for seniors to a maximum of $800. And we ensured that GIS recipients could qualify for a rebate on municipal property taxes. So, Mr. Speaker, there are many things that we did, but did we do enough? Of course not. No, we only had 4 years. Have the NDP's accomplishments been sustained and built upon by our current government? In some cases, yes, and in some cases, no. Which brings me back to the idea of the concept of social investment, Mr. Speaker. The basic idea behind social investment is that people have to live. And if people have to live, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that they cannot live on less than $15 an hour on a minimum wage, and that is why we have brought this forward for your consideration today. Thank you very much.
Order, please. Time has elapsed.